Hello, Subversion and Liberty Weekly listeners. I am Trey from the Subversion Webcast, joined by Patrick MacFarlane. We had intended to do a in-person discussion once again, but given limitations to time and everything like that, we're doing this remotely and live streaming. So hello, live streamers. And today, Patrick and I are going to be talking about domestic violence. And Patrick actually created a very good domestic violence paper for a class of his. So that's what we're here to discuss today. So how's it going, Patrick?
Pretty good, man. Good to interact with you again.
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah, too bad we couldn't meet up in person, but such c'est la vie. Wait, that's not right.
Yeah.
Such is life.
Well, next weekend, actually, good time to plug this. Patrick and I will both be at Agora Fest, and we'll both be speaking. My topic will be on just general strategy for libertarians, what's best for libertarians going forward. And I'm personally going to focus on some sort of hyper-individualism, sort of how we can find freedom in an unfree world and how fixing yourself is more productive than trying to vote yourself free. So that's more the direction that I'm going to be going. So yeah, if you're in the Twin Cities area, it'd be fun to have you join us.
Yeah, that's at the Doubletree Hilton, or it's at the Doubletree. I don't know what time of the day I'm speaking. I don't know about you either, but
yeah, I don't have anything set on the schedule yet, but I've been in contact with the promoters and everything, so.
Yeah, it should be a lot of fun. So I'm hoping that people will come meet us if you live in the Twin Cities area.
Absolutely. So yeah, this domestic violence paper really captured my attention and also my curiosity and creativity, if you will, for solving this problem. Because I think the biggest thing about domestic violence or any other statist issue is that the government has been inept in actually doing anything about it. And as you detail in this paper, maybe even worse than that, they make the problem worse. So, I mean, you start really in the article and it reads sort of like a screed against the state in a way, but I hope that people take away from it just this general human problem of violating the rights and liberties of another person, and to engage in this identity politics issue sort of from a different angle than people usually do. So I found that very insightful.
Oh yeah, I appreciate that. What I really wanted to do was take it and speak the language of these feminists, because the biggest activists in this community on this issue, the battered women's movement, as it's called, I believe now, or the anti-partner violence, there's a PC term that, I'm not privy to. Well, I'm privy to it, but I just don't embrace it. But it is kind of run by the feminists, and the anti-domestic violence, the history of it is a kind of a feminist movement. So I wanted to speak right to them. And I was surprised to find out that they know the problem with the state and they've dealt with it. And many of them have embraced the state as a solution, unfortunately. So what I was trying to do was tap into that underlying what I found sentiment against the state, because they see the state as the enforcer of the patriarchy. So I wanted to tap into that and speak a language that they would understand.
Absolutely. And, it's almost like the logic goes that, if the public sector doesn't do it, then nobody's going to, right?
Yeah.
But we'll find later on in this paper that that's quite the opposite of the case. That, and you see this with every social problem. I feel like the pattern is there that any sort of social problem that gets solved, it's never through some sort of top-down decree. It's always through people who see a problem and go out of their way to actually fix the problem. You can't just call for some statist policy and then pat yourself on the back knowing that you did a good thing by advocating a certain public sector policy. It has to be from this sort of, like you talk about in this paper, a grassroots movement. So it's all about focusing on what will actually solve the problem for these women who are victims of what we would consider the worst violations of individual liberty, the violation of your life and property of your body.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is that these are NAP violations. You know, domestic violence violates the NAP. It's not like a victimless crime. So you have the dual problem here of, you know, well, we want to criminalize and enforce domestic violence policy on one hand because you are getting NAP violations. It's not a victimless crime, but at the same time, this contributes massively to mass incarceration. It's not the biggest issue, but it also has done that. So I want to do, before we really get into the meat of the paper, I wanted to talk about my professor, because I took this as a seminar class, and my professor is very, very smart, and she actually, I didn't expect her to, because, you know, I'm assuming that everyone is a lefty statist, and I believe she was left, but she really, really encouraged me in this paper and encouraged my unorthodox views, because what I really found was that there are a lot of hyper intelligent people dealing with this issue and inside the system, and people working very, very hard and doing good work, but they're just grappling with this problem that, I don't want to say I'm going to come in and solve everything, you know, with libertarian theory, but they know the system is broken. They know it's broken, but they've been trying and struggling with the same solutions, and they just don't know really how to tackle it. They don't know how to deal with it because, you know, the perverse incentives of the state, all they want to do is throw more money at it, or, you know. But I guess what I wanted to highlight is that there's a lot of really smart people working on this, and they just are having a hard time figuring it out, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, just to stay on that point about colleges, I think myself, like a lot of people, have become very cynical to the environment that are on college campuses. And myself, I mean, I went to a community college, so I wasn't necessarily around these really sort of neo-Marxist ideas, if you will. I mean, the couple sort of extra classes that I had to take to get my degree were, it was an English class, but what's funny about it is it was more of like a critical race theory class, is what it ended up being, because we read about James Baldwin the entire time, and my professor was a Dominican Republic immigrant, which is fine. And she, but the thing is, the agenda was so heavy in the class that it wasn't even about the structure of the English language. And she, I mean, there wasn't even any focus on like correct grammar and spelling and things like that. And a lot of these kids that came from the inner city were obviously never really had very good education. I mean, I think I'm very lucky that I came from a poor family, but was able to actually go to a decent, all things considered, a decent public school in a decently, and it's probably more the community than anything. But you see what I'm saying, that perhaps the focus that we take in how we solve any problem, a lot of people focus on, like you said, just throwing money at a problem might not be the solution, because inner city schools are some of the highest funded school districts in the country, and they have the highest illiteracy rates. So, I mean, at some point, you got to kind of consider that just throwing capital at something isn't necessarily the problem. And perhaps there is more of a structural issue, which I think this paper certainly gets at. But anyway, what I was trying to get at was that you've sort of made me question my cynicism on college campuses, because from the stories that I've heard from you, that, yeah, there are people that are making genuine critiques of problems in the world. And even if we don't agree with their, you know, super left-wing solutions to these, that they are making valid critiques. And this is certainly one of them.
Yeah, they get it. You know, they get it. They know the problem. And it's just and not all of them want super statist solutions either. And they're pushing for a cultural change, obviously, one that we wouldn't agree with. But the two biggest things they're grappling with, one is to criminalize or not to criminalize. Another one is mandatory policies or not mandatory policies. And another one is embrace the state or don't embrace the state. And what Leigh Goodmark gets at, who I cite in the paper, she is citing this distrust of the state in domestic violence policy. But there is a quote in the paper where she says, well, a lot of battered women's advocates wouldn't while some battered women's advocates want to embrace the state and some don't, they all agree that they don't want to go back to the days where it was a private matter, where domestic violence was a private matter only between husbands and without the state involvement. So they're butting up against the state monopoly that's happening. And so way back in the day when it started, I make the point, and Leigh Goodmark makes the point too, that there was no recourse. Battered women, the state actually embraced and allowed these men to beat their wives because the state would not offer any legal recourse. And because, as we know, the state has a monopoly, there was no recourse aside from, banding together with your sisters and, fighting right on the ground.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I just got done reading Fool's Errand by Scott Horton. And it doesn't seem like this is going to be a related point, but actually the way that violence against women is handled in Afghanistan is to pay restitution to the husband of a woman who is raped or beaten. So these are sort of like, these go back to biblical sort of superstitions about how we handle property claims, and that essentially the history and these people, these very leftist folks, have a very good critique that it is historically, the institution of marriage itself is historically about ownership of another person. So even in my own life, I've sort of had to reconcile the institution that marriage historically was and what it is today, and how I handle that with my own personal relationship. But I guess I just choose to, use that social apparatus to the advantage of my personal relationship, because it's strange to without getting married, you don't actually have the legal agency of your spouse. So if I were to ever get into an accident, or my wife were to ever get into an accident, I'm not able to make legal decisions for her if she's not conscious, unless we were married. So there's actually an element of protection now, that if you're not married, then you can't protect the ones that you love closest to you. So yeah, it's a double-edged sword, what marriage historically was and what it is today.
Well, it's social engineering at its finest, and this is in my family law class, we were talking about it, and what they were talking about, how should we define marriage and how should we deal with it, and there wasn't a lot of mention made of, how about let's not define what marriage is. And I was the only one to bring up this point, that this is social engineering 101. A lot of the policy that we grapple with now has its roots in the progressive era, and the progressive era is profoundly eugenicist. And if I'm not mistaken, the first purpose of what marriage licensing was to prevent the races from mixing, or to prevent, it was control. It's a mechanism of control and influencing society.
I could see that.
Certainly. So, but to get back to domestic violence, it just, I kept seeing the major point that I wanted to make, and what really surprised me with this paper was that, and I guess it's kind of a no-brainer, but the impetus behind the domestic violence movement is private, and some of the first aid societies came about voluntarily to help these battered women. But the progressives get in, and there were some progressives behind it in the beginning, but the progressives get in and they embrace the state. I'm reading this book about Murray Rothbard's the progressive era, but also this book by a Princeton author, Thomas C. Leonard, and he talks about the eugenicist history of the progressive movement, and it's eye-opening. I mean, these quotes are as bad as you can get. You would think they are from like Nazi, SS officers, but no, they're from American economists from Wisconsin. Some of them. Well, they studied in Wisconsin, not from Wisconsin. They're from New England families, but yeah. So it's all kind of, all of this is wrapped up. It all has to deal with each other, and the profound. The profound nature of the progressive movement is that eugenicist history, but you find out that it's so linked to how our policies are today. So sorry to keep going.
Oh, that's okay. And getting into and reading your paper, it didn't really connect with me how this problem is symptomatic of a lot of other problems. And you could even say that a lot of the reasons why we have a domestic violence problem and the ones unique to America specifically are rooted in, like you were saying, progressive policies by marginalizing Black people in this country and Hispanic people in this country through labor unions within the old progressive movement is where we sort of get the dynastic cycle of poverty within marginalized groups, from keeping them from being able to engage in the market as competitors in free labor. So one great insight that I've gotten from Walter Williams, and I haven't actually read this book, but I know a lot about the points that he makes, that the progressive era, with not even unintentionally, very intentionally kept Blacks and Latinos and Asians out of the workforce, and even women out of the workforce. So, I mean, if we really want to look at who created this problem, we should be honest about the history of that, and be honest about, as a progressive, if you are one, to look at the problem honestly. And it seems to me that the people that are usually calling for state intervention, if you do anything to question that creed, then it's almost like you don't want the problem to be solved at all, which calls to mind Bastiat's most famous quote that I know of, that government confuses the distinction between government and society. Like I was saying earlier, you can't just pat yourself on the back thinking that calling for a policy is exactly what we need, because and at the end of Bastiat's quote, he says it's almost as if because we don't want the state to raise grain, that we don't want people to eat. And I think that's such a reduction, and it's so commonplace with people. Right now, the debate is over guns, right? And that's the huge issue going on right now. And literally, my entire argument ends up coming down to the state is inept at this. And I mean, just yesterday, the FBI released a statement saying that they knew about this and failed to act. So if we're charging these people with security, it should be very obvious by now that they are not very good at it, and that we have to be more creative on how we solve these problems.
Yeah, and it's a cultural thing as much as anything else. But yeah, I was going to say the recent distraction in the news cycle, which is the shooting. But well, one of the societal things that I harp on, and what Leigh Goodmark and others like her have, and I'm citing her because I quoted her the most in the paper, but the biggest correlation, I think, is lower wages and unemployment with domestic violence. And I would say, I would think another one would be drug use. Those are the two biggest things, and they're really kind of grappling with this. A lot of them have kind of eschewed the idea of the cycle of violence. What I've heard is that they're kind of backing away from that. But I mean, you get so many young men growing up without fathers, and I think that's this is the conservative in me talking, because I prefer the family unit. But you get so much of that, and I think that is the biggest driver of this. You get young men that don't have a father figure, or they have an absent father figure, or a terrible father figure, and it just this develops, the cycle of command and control. And I don't want to focus on men beating women either, because there is a substantial amount of the reverse. And so you could claim it's kind of sexist against men. I mean, we don't talk in that collectivized language, but you can make that claim that all of this is about men beating women. Well, it goes the other way too, fathers beating their sons.
Yeah, and I mean, to your point about the whole family unit thing, just in the interest of full disclosure, I came from a single parent household. I was raised by my mother with my sister, and so it really is sort of a conflicting thing for me, because I'm a hardcore libertarian now, and I have very solid values. And and they were imbued by my mother. But I do recognize that a lot of the behavioral problems that I and my sister both had may be partially to do with the fact that my father was largely absent from my adolescent life. Luckily for us, we had a very strong extended family and had a lot of father figures in our grandparents and uncles and things like that. So even though the immediate family of mine was very broken, there's still a case to be made that the traditional family unit was what gave me the opportunity to be here and be a successful and productive person as I am. So yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. And it's so controversial with people, especially progressives, where you can't even bring this up because it's all about, that women should be independent from men, which I don't think that any of us really argue from a legal standpoint, but I think we're just making the case that from a cultural convention sort of standpoint on what norms are, that it is probably a good thing that families have a mother and father figure in their homes, which I obviously, and I just sort of thought about this in the event of a same-sex household. And your paper didn't get to this, but I know that I've read that lesbian and gay couples have some disparaging domestic violence figures themselves. If I remember right, lesbian households or lesbian couples experience higher domestic violence rates than even heterosexual couples. So one has to even consider that yeah, there may be some sort of correlation to what's happening inside the family. And yeah, that, like I said, we just have to be honest about the root of the problem if we're ever going to solve these issues.
Yeah, I mean, somebody's got to raise those kids.
Yeah.
So someone has to guide them. Someone has to be there when they fail, and tell them, and build them back up again, and tell them that they're worth it. And that's the biggest problem, I think, is just propagating this whole issue. But to get more into the technicality of it, from a legal standpoint, I kind of walk through in the paper too how the state is not accountable. And we see this with, Warren v. District of Columbia is cited a lot. I've done work on that. I believe that's episode 46, 47, or 48. It's in there somewhere. But another one is, I bet this boiled your blood. What do you think about the Castle Rock case? Have you heard of it before the paper?
No, I hadn't. And I had notes in here to talk about that because both of those cases show that police really, I mean, even on the books, police are not there to protect us. That they are there presumably just to collect fines and ensure their jobs tomorrow. It seems to be their interest. And it seems that public sector policing, there is a profit motive there. Everybody operates on a profit motive, and progressives and leftist types really don't like it when I say this, but for example, they talk about private prisons. And I say to them, well, how do you suppose that the public sector works? I mean, the profit motive of the LEO and guard unions is very strong, wouldn't you say? That these people have every interest, just as a private sector enterprise would, to have their jobs tomorrow. The only difference being that a private sector at least has to accommodate their consumers in some sort of fashion to have their jobs. I mean, the checks don't just keep rolling in. And that's really the biggest insight that I could offer to any just normal people who aren't tuned into the lexicon of libertarianism, is that these are just people too, and they just have a job like any of us, and they want their job tomorrow too. And a lot of them don't deserve it. And I think you make that very clear in this case, or in this paper, that not only has the state been inept at solving this problem, but think of all the money wasted that could otherwise be going to actually relieving the situation of these victims. But one thing that sort of has me conflicted about this entire thing is a lot of these women who are in these relationships feel dependent on their abuser. So one thing that I was going to kind of ask you is sort of what your thoughts on that are, because as voluntarists, as libertarians, we believe that the voluntary interactions, what we can observe from that, signals to us the value scale of a person. So it would be really challenging to me, and I can see it happening, that someone who would challenge my viewpoint on this particular issue would say to me, well, how do you deal with this under your logical conclusions? You know what I mean? Like that is sort of a challenging thing for me to reckon with, because even if you were to even, like, let's say you were to take a very violent approach to defending these women. Let's say you were going to go door to door and use violence against the husband to defend the woman. She may even hold you back from hurting him and from defending her. So it's a very complicated matter. And to just say that you can just send in government and use some sort of policy like that sort of leaves a lot of issues to deal with as to what creates the scenario that a person would hurt the people that are closest to them.
Yeah, and that's a valid concern. You know, there's a lot of those tough questions and moral conundrums to confront, and that's what they deal a lot with in my seminar, what my professor was talking about. But I would always just point to, the very fact that the first answer to domestic violence was a private women's shelter in Chicago. I believe it was Chicago, and I mean, that it was voluntary. That was before the state, they appealed to the state, but this was grassroots. It came about as women banding together to save each other. And I think that's a solution. There's no reason that private women's shelters, wouldn't proliferate. I think it's also a cultural thing, because what we need to do is encourage, an environment where women are able to leave and be independent, and that has to do with easing up of economics and unburdening private enterprises and encouraging small business and stuff like that. If the economy was robust, I think one of the biggest things preventing women from leaving, there is the emotional part too, but logistically, speaking from my own experience as well. Not that I was a battered woman or anything, but my wife was in a bad relationship when we met, and there was that process of how do I get her away from this? Well, for her it was logistics, it was money, and having someone to turn to, just me, even, and maybe there's something to be said about men that could help women too, but just giving women these opportunities. Financial opportunities, just improving the economy in ways that we would as libertarians, I think would be a big help. But the third answer I have to that is that we are stuck in the status lexicon of policing, and that is reactionary. The status lexicon is not preventative. The problem with the state is that they don't prevent this. They can only come in after a child has been exposed to abuse, or after a woman has been beaten, and or a man has been beaten by his wife. I don't want to get stuck in that dichotomy, but and that's what I get into with the Detroit Threat Management Center and their Victory program, and maybe we could get into that a little bit. But first, I wanted to take a little pause here halfway through and thank our sponsor, and that sponsor is gotenna.com. And that's GOTENNA. And GoTenna is great. They're our first sponsor. They provide wireless mesh networking for your cell phone. And so this little gadget here, you pair with your cell phone, and it connects you to a mesh network of other cell phones that allow you to send GPS coordinates, private encrypted messaging, and I believe phone calls as well. And this is a great service. This is the grassroots, bottom-up kind of thing that we've been talking about on the podcast. And this is great for traveling abroad. It's also great for being out in the boonies and doing some camping areas that don't have self-service. Very good for that. So if you want to check out Gotenna, go to gotenna.com and use promo code Liberty35 at checkout to get $35 off your first purchase. So thank you so much to Gotenna. So yeah, but so to get in a little bit to the second half, which is talking about Detroit Threat Management Center. Had you heard of them before, Trey?
Yes, and I'm a big fan of them. I've been using videos of Dale Brown in interviews a lot, especially when the difficult question of public sector policing comes up. I find this to be one of the hardest things to talk about with normies, if you will. Is that they like healthcare, and I've heard this a lot from people that are very close to me who are not quite sold on private property, is that they believe that the healthcare sector is an example of something which a market does not work for. And I think they would also throw policing in with that, because their argument is that there's no money to be made off of helping people, which I think is patently false. And I've heard you say this before, in fact, that what we really need are entrepreneurs who are daring, who are willing to take the risk to do something that is really not only a benefit to society in the services that you're providing, but provide some sort of philanthropic endeavor. And that's exactly what the Detroit Threat Management Center does. And actually, the profit model is really great. Basically, what Dale Brown says is, hey, we provide a really good private security service for our corporate clients, and they pay us so well, and we do such a good job that we can provide this service for free to battered women. It helps our PR, it protects women. It's an all-around win-win. And I just, like I was talking about earlier, this is just one of the many examples of the way that markets are able to come up with a solution to problems in a much more creative way, and it looks like a much more effective way. It's not like they go into homes and intervene extremely violently. They literally just like hold back the abuser and get the woman away from the situation, which is a lot better than, like you had talked about earlier in the paper, that the incarceration of the domestic the aggressor, if you will, which, by the way, the aggressor is always perceived as the man, even if the woman is the person abusing. So that person gets locked up in a cage. And I mean, one has to even think of how that goes through the mind of an abuser. You know, like, what does that tell them? That just tells them that their wife is a narc and that they called the cops on them and that they're going to get an extra couple beatings next time. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I mean, I'm just not sure that, that there's even a simple solution to this. So people like the Detroit Threat Management Center are taking this very seriously and with a multi-lateral approach that I feel like deals with each scenario very specifically, rather than just dealing with it from some statutory position.
Yeah, and well, to take the first thing that you mentioned, the idea that there's no benefit from policing or there's no profit to be made from policing is just so patently false. It's just ridiculous that, one thing Dale Brown talked about, and what he said is when he started this big company, it was literally just him walking around a neighborhood, and what he ended up doing was talking to managers of apartment complexes and saying, I'll stay here and I'll prevent crime from happening. And I can't remember exactly how it was, if they gave him one apartment building, like an apartment room or something, they paid him. But he was saying, surprise, surprise, the neighborhood flourishes and grows when old people can, safely go from the bus stop to their houses, or when people aren't getting murdered on your property, it tends to help business. And so what he's saying is the first thing that would happen is that suddenly people felt safe to go to the convenience store. And when people felt safe to go to the convenience store started being profitable. And then when that started happening, the community just built up around it. And so they're getting stuck in this dichotomy that it's a zero-sum game when you help someone. And as we know, any transaction is not a zero-sum game. Both sides benefit from it. And I'm trying to, what are some of the other things that you mentioned?
I do, before we get any further on any of the points that I made, I just want to say that that just because if people view policing as this thing that only the state can do from a statutory standpoint, then you also have to recognize that in reality we have a problem with government actually creating. Like I said earlier, it all encourages predatory policing in this sort of the profit motive that is perverse by being a public sector entity. And you bring that up several times in that the public sector is guarded from any sort of accountability when they do not fulfill on their obligation, which is purportedly to protect people. So I would just say that, leaving healthcare aside, I just use that as a good, parallel to this. But the fact that the Castle Rock versus Gonzalez case very clearly shows that they don't have any sort of obligation and no interest really in enforcing any kind of restraining order that would protect women. And it seems that their resources for that police department, I would imagine, without me even knowing, I'm sure that they were out on the street just looking for traffic tickets and some drugs in people's cars and things like that. So, I mean, just from the whole inability to use the private sector to protect people, I think that's just patently and categorically false, especially. And we don't know how a completely Ancapistan free market world will work, right? But we can say without any sort of doubt how things work right now and how these things are perverse. But some of the other points that I was making about Detroit Threat Management Center is that yeah, I mean they're providing a multilateral service to a lot of different people. It's not they're not some dedicated service where all they're doing is going around just policing neighborhoods with a strong arm. It's not just someone running around carrying a huge stick. There is an actual mission there. So I mean, I just do not see that sort of incentive and that sort of goal from the public sector. And even though they say that they do, if you look at the slogans on any LEO sort of pro LEO propaganda, it's all about protecting the weak and things like that. But to me, they're not protecting the individual; they're protecting the public. So I don't see them protecting any sort of minority.
Yeah, and that's the reality that you confront with Warren v. District of Columbia and also the Castle Rock case. But in Warren v. District of Columbia, they clearly articulate, and it is only a D.C. Court of Appeals case. So it is. I saw someone on Facebook the other day saying that it was a Supreme Court case. No, it's not even a federal case. It's a D.C. case. So D.C. Court of Appeals is it's the court of last resort for the political entity that is D.C. So it's kind of like if the Wisconsin Supreme Court came out with a ruling. It's not binding in any federal jurisdiction. But the thing about it is that they say this is a clearly articulated font of law that the police owe no duty to specific individuals of protection. And that it has to do with tort law and stuff that I don't necessarily want to get into. But we were talking about this Castle Rock v. Gonzalez case, and let me just go over the fact pattern for very quickly. Is that because it's very infuriating, and I think people need to know about it. And it didn't happen too long ago, but the basic fact pattern is that there was a woman who had a court-ordered restraining order against her estranged husband. The kids were playing in the front yard, and the estranged husband came up and abducted them. And she was called the police 4 or 5 times during the day to try and get them to enforce this court-ordered restraining order. And eventually she ends up getting she got a call from the husband saying he was at an amusement park in Denver and that he had the kids there, and she went to the police station and asked them, please, will you go check and put out an all points bulletin? And the guy at the police station said, get lost, I'm going to go have dinner or something. So eventually, in the middle of the night, the estranged husband shows up at the police station, and he commits suicide via cop, and they shoot him. And in the front seat of his truck, they find 3 dead girls. And the court, I can't remember if that was a Supreme Court. Yeah, it was a Supreme Court case. And the court is trying to decide whether there is a property interest in the enforcement of a restraining order. But the problem is that the Supreme Court is a federal court, and this happened in a municipality. And so not a federal obviously, and so the question is whether the Supreme Court can find a property interest through the 14th Amendment. And now this is a federal solution to the problem. This is not a state solution. And that kind of goes to it. And so the Supreme Court says, no, there's no property interest in the enforcement of this restraining order through the 14th Amendment, but that does not prevent the states from imposing liability by statute. So there could be some statutory solutions to this, but they are deciding not to impose it on the states through the 14th Amendment. But like I say in the paper, that for Ms. Gonzalez, that doesn't help her, obviously, because they're denying it. And although I would support states' rights over the federal government, it doesn't console Ms. Gonzalez at all. But the kicker of it is that Justice Ginsburg, of all people, Justice Ginsburg says in her dissent that if this was a private contract between a security company to protect her, there most definitely, obviously, would be a property interest there. And so that's what we're confronting here. The state of Colorado, or the township, or whatever municipality or governmental branch it was up to, could have written a law that would impose a property interest here, but they just didn't, and most states do not. And so that's the problem. So
you're suggesting that in the event that this was a private sector contract, that you're saying that there would be a sort of positive obligation on behalf of the security firm, because that's one thing that I sort of struggle with, just in the whole, just to sideline onto private property ethics. I'm curious to get your take on this from a legal perspective, because I always just argue that profit motive itself is strong enough that you don't even need a sort of legal positive obligation, and that the event of the contract being reneged on and the service not being rendered, that would merit quite a bit of restitution on behalf of the enterprise that reneged on the contract. So yeah, I mean, I guess I'm just asking for clarification if what you're saying is that judge is trying to say that there would be a positive right on behalf of Gonzalez in that case, if it were a private firm.
Yeah, and so it comes down to breach of contract and contractual obligations. So I hesitate to say that. So if Gonzalez contracted with the private security firm and the guy shows up and murders her, out of plain sight, there might not be, because it has to be negligent. It depends on what the terms of the contract are, but there could be a clause saying, if Miss Gonzalez called the private security firms 5 or 6 times asking for help and they did nothing, then they would find something. But if Miss Gonzalez was just walking around her house and all of a sudden a strange husband shows up and shoots her in the head, that might not be quite as foreseeable as a problem. So it depends on the contract, but that would be one mechanism that would hold the private security firm accountable. Another one would be market forces, obviously. If even if they weren't negligent in enforcing the contract, and the woman is murdered anyways, it was just not foreseeable. Well, you would wonder if someone would contract with them anymore. But
yeah. And it seems to all circle back to the fact that there is no sort of competition in place for public sector security. I mean, the checks keep rolling in for these people. There's
Yeah.
no way for it, there's no mechanism that restricts that capital from coming in. There's no customer feedback with the actual capital. So, I mean,
Oh, wait. You can vote.
oh yeah, yeah. No, that's just the thing with people is, that meager vote really seems to mean a lot more to other people than it does to me.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
I think maybe it's because maybe I'm jaded from trying to engage in politics for so long and seeing that I'm pushing a boulder up a hill that I just see voting myself free as a fool's errand, if you will.
yeah. Well, well, even if voting actually did anything, what tells us more about the market? A bunch of people's opinions or a bunch of people participating in their own self-interest,
Yeah,
in the market process.
and the Austrian insight is exactly that. You could take a survey, and the next day, the person that answered that survey, their value scale might change, and there's no way for them to go back on that. Whereas in a market, you can buy one product. In the commodities market, at least, you can buy one product one week, and if you don't like it next week, you can buy a different product. So, I mean, um, of course, this abstracts the question of security, but the principle is rather the same, especially in a time when communication is rather decentralized. I mean, if you consider it, your options for communication itself is extremely versatile. I mean, your cell phone will pick up transmits from different towers, and they might charge you more for being outside of your network, but the principle remains the same, that you have the ability to notify someone, even if they're not as close in municipal terms, close to you as a security firm. So, I mean, I can just see the response time, like let's say in the Twin Cities itself, right? The response time for a security firm that might be based in Coon Rapids may still be able to get to me faster than the actual Minneapolis police themselves. Just to share an anecdote of mine, my work van, I'm a tradesman, my work van was broken into in St. Paul, and the police, they basically told me, well, a police officer won't be able to get out there for at least 8 hours. And I never heard anything from them. I just went to work and I never heard anything from them for 2 days. And I called them and I had to tell them what to put on the police report. Not that, what's on the police report is supposed to be them coming on site, looking at it, and basically for a bureaucratic formality for the insurance company, hand them a piece of paper with a stamp on it. And I had to go out of my way, tell them exactly what I wanted on the piece of paper, and then go to the police department and get them to print it out. And I had to pay them to do that. I had to pay them 75 cents for the piece of paper and the ink. You know what I mean?
Wow.
So
Yeah.
It's like, what the hell do I even pay taxes for?
Yeah.
You know?
Well,
so how can I vote that away? I don't think I can.
Well, and from the reverse standpoint, you get a private enterprise that's like, yes, come, we want to serve you, we want your business, please, let us handle your dispute. But yeah, well, I wanted to in the interest of providing some details, I wanted to read that quote from Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the most liberal member of the Supreme Court. She says, in the Gonzalez case, she says, surely if respondent had contracted with a private security firm to provide her and her daughters with protection from her husband, it would be apparent that she possessed a property interest in such a contract. Respondent's claim of entitlement to this promised service is no less legitimate than the other claims our cases have upheld, and no less concrete than a hypothetical agreement with a private firm. Bam, mic drop. That right there, and the implication being is that it's not illegal to start a private security firm. So what the hell are we waiting for? What are we waiting for? We need people to start private security firms. Don't like the cops? Well, then start a private security firm. I don't know, what is it, bitcop.org or CopWatch, or do you know if they're doing stuff like this? I think they should be.
Yeah, I agree with you that they should be. And it's a lot like let me compare this to the whole YouTube controversy where a lot of people like Dennis Prager just whine about how YouTube isn't is censoring conservatives and things like that. Well, you are always preaching about the market. Why don't you just go out there and create a better YouTube
Yeah,
that, they might censor some violent content or something like that. I think I would agree that violent content is probably not appropriate, especially if it's like, people getting beheaded or things like that. You can
yeah,
see that being censored, right? But you can create alternative platforms for things, and there's no reason why we. And I mean, for all of the great things that Cop Block does, they expose a lot of really terrible stuff that the police are doing. But they could be monetizing that, and they could be spending or investing that in some sort of uh, counter economic activity, if you will.
yeah.
So
And
no, I agree with you, and I think that would be a noble thing to take up. And I'm almost overwhelmed by the ideas that I could have for all these businesses, but never myself. I'm guilty of never taking the time and the money to actually do anything with it myself. So yeah, I mean that's a really excellent point. I'd have to agree with you.
yeah, and maybe what I should do is start like an alternative dispute resolution institute or something like that. But yeah, so the to talk a little bit more about specifically what Detroit Threat Management Center does is they have this preventative approach, and I'm going off of the excuse me, I'm still a little sick here from last week, but I'm going off of the Tom Woods episode that he had with Commander Dale Brown because I heard that Dale Brown's a busy guy and he doesn't do a lot of interviews, which is completely understandable because he's working in Detroit. Um, but he just says, I'll read this block if you'll bear with me. He says, I created a sustainable system. I train people as bodyguards to create excellence in managing human threats through nonviolent approaches. And as a result, well, who'd have thunk, it turns out that wealthy people get wealthier when there's less death, carnage, lawsuits, injuries, and incarcerations on their property. This means that this means that they like my peaceful approach because it means more prosperity for them. But my focal point was always community, family safety, and not allowing violent criminals to attack families. So it's a win-win for everyone, mutually beneficial exchange. And it's sustainable because it's profitable. And people need to know that there's prosperity with preventative protection as a model for managing human threats. And he talks about how the police department, when he came to Detroit, was all about arresting people and creating crimes and entrapping people and doing the drug trade because, as we know, the police are just another gang in the drug trade. And he goes on saying, I created prosperous outcomes over and over without losses, without injuries, without deaths, no killings of unarmed people, no killings of innocents. And we've been attacked. We started seeing, in the most ultra-violent situations, and I learned through these extremely violent conditions better ways to deal with things and better outcomes. And all I can tell you is that it was also because I had to. I'm accountable. I have no qualified immunity. That means if I put my hands on someone, it has to be legal. There has to be a way for me to explain this as a civilian. And as a result, we've had no court cases in 20 years and no lawsuits in 20 years. So, can you say the same of your local police department?
No, and actually, this brings up a really solid and compelling idea that I came across when reading your paper. Is that this Warren v. District of Columbia, considering that and the Castle Rock versus Gonzalez case, seems to conflict with some propaganda that I've heard from the Thin Blue Line crowd that in the event of a police shooting, there's at least one person who is among the commenters online who will tell you that, oh, well, the legal stipulations are that a police officer has to shoot, otherwise they can be held, accountable for negligence.
Yeah,
But it seems to conflict. It seems to conflict with those two court decisions, doesn't it? Where
Yeah.
Dale Brown just basically says that, hey, my incentives are a lot better just for the simple fact that I'm held to the same standard as any average Joe on the street that were to want to take up the task of doing this for people. Whereas the police not only do not have that obligation to protect people versus enforce a statute, they seem to, some of them at least, seem to think that they have the legal obligation to actually escalate violence rather than de-escalate, which seems to be the exact opposite of what this private security firm does. And I don't even know that Dale Brown is this hardcore libertarian type. I think he's just a rational person who sees this issue for what it is and is working within the world that he is to do the right thing. So
Yeah.
I don't think you have to be a hardcore libertarian to even see these critiques as something very valid and that we're not dealing with this situation very well.
Yeah, you don't, and that's kind of also what I preach is that, you don't have to convince a lefty liberal that of free market economics to illustrate to them personally that the Detroit Threat Management Center is better than the cops. You don't even have to convince them of anything. They see how it benefits them. They love Uber and Lyft, and although Uber and Lyft are becoming more cronyist, the model is there. The model is there. And yeah, it's great.
Yeah, and just to tie it all back to domestic violence, man, like we said earlier, there are a lot of things that play into this. And the sad thing is, I think the police sort of recognize, or at least the people that operate this apparatus recognize that it is a larger problem.
Yeah.
But their entire solution is broken window policing, to just go after all these little offenses because they think, oh, well, if a little person who commits little crimes like drug possession or breaking into cars and burglary and things like that, then surely they would commit violent crimes, which I would agree with. But the solution seems, for broken window policing, it seems like the solution to lock people up and send them to criminal college is the exact opposite of what you would want, which seems to turn out people who are more mentally unstable than when they went in and more prone to violence because they've had just learned from however many years or months or whatever they were in prison that that's how they are to protect themselves. So basically, we just create the problem. And yeah, this theme just comes up in the first section of your paper, that incarceration, and you don't get into the depth of the criminal justice problem itself, but I think it's sort of implied that that incarcerating people is obviously not the way that we deal with this problem. And if we really want to defend women, that we have to do it and not just say that we're advocates.
Yeah, and this is I think the police know that they're fighting a losing battle, and maybe if you're a thin blue line type, you need to realize that it's not working. And cops describe the beat as a war, war stories or something like that, and they know they're fighting a losing battle. You hear about the grind and you hear about all the terrible things in the world. Well, you're losing, and you know it. And just like the war on drugs, they know they're losing it. It should be obvious to anyone that they're losing it because drugs are still out there. They're still as prevalent as ever. And are we just supposed to keep wasting this human capital for the rest of eternity? How long is it going to take until we realize, like in the 1920s, that prohibition does not work? It doesn't work. And we need something else. But I wanted to get into that too, and maybe we'll close up after this, but the biggest thing I wanted, that the biggest concern of the feminists is the agency of women, and women having all the autonomy that they deserve, their natural rights. And the biggest critique of these mandatory policies is A, they're heavy-handed, B, the state doesn't know what the solution is in these individual situations, and C or 3, they do limit the choices that have women made. They do limit the choices that women have. And I've seen this personally doing public defender work in the cities here. There are mandatory DANCOs, domestic abuse no contact orders, and a lot of times the victim doesn't want it. And you could talk about, that could be because they're abused and they don't know what they want and they're dealing with a lot of things, and that's valid, but it's not consensual, these mandatory DANCOs, and it is no contact, and the judge always says no contact means no contact. And I've heard people being violated on Dankos because they drove their girlfriend to the hospital and they were the only person to be there and do that at that time. You know, someone giving birth to a child, you drive her to the hospital even though she needs it, and you violated a Danko and you're going to jail. You know, and I
Yeah, and I
yeah
I often bring up with people that, you know, the worst things that happen in this world, the worst violations of personal liberty, the worst most egregious things come as a result of people who genuinely think that they're doing the right thing, people who genuinely believe in what they do. It's not malicious people who do the worst things in the world. They're do-gooders. They're people who think that they are doing the right thing for people. Someone like Hillary Clinton would be a very good example of someone who I genuinely believe is totally sold on her ideology.
oh really,
And
I think she's a sociopathic psychopath demon
I
person.
I think she yeah, I that's a good question. I guess more than anything, I just mean that's the way I tend to look at it, because I always you know my personality, Pat. I just always
Yeah,
try to
yeah.
give people the benefit of the doubt, and that I feel like the best thing I can do is just say that yeah, like I'm saying, um, that even if she is crazy, psychopathic, you know, because she's just a neocon that talks a big game about
Yeah.
identity politics. That's all she is. So whether or not she actually believes in that or not, I feel like people like her or Woodrow Wilson or Teddy Roosevelt are really good examples of people who, you know, at least they purport to be do-gooders, right?
Yeah.
And that their solutions in and of themselves are wholly inconsistent with their goals.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean that's a really great example that you just brought up. These no contact orders. Um, yeah, that's a really hard thing to think about, especially given that I just brought up earlier that how do we square this whole like battered women syndrome kind of thing with the domestic violence thing, and that I think it should be apparent by now in this conversation that it's not a simple, there's no simple solution, that it's a very complex problem that runs very deep. In it's a cultural issue, it's an economic issue, and it's an issue that we have relegated to just the social apparatus of violence. And I always say that if the government is a social apparatus of violence, then wouldn't it follow that the market is the social apparatus of cooperation, and that perhaps we should do more to engage in that and solve problems with that rather than just, you know, putting everything through centralized courts.
Yeah. And that's a beautiful way of saying it. And that's a good bookend to this. But before we go, there was one thing that I wanted to talk about. You mentioned the thin blue line people saying that they're obligated to shoot someone and they could be sued if they don't. That's a load of horse crap, because this Warren v. District of Columbia case delineates the case law, the common law decision, and that is that we're not going to impose liability on police officers for not acting. A police officer has to undertake a duty. So, you know, some of the things that they would say that police officers have not been held accountable for is, one case was a police officer, and this is talked about in Warren v. DC. There was a case where a police officer was following a obviously drunk driver, and there were many signs, many opportunities for him to stop. I think he even followed the drunk driver out of the bar, and he didn't stop him, and the drunk driver ended up hitting and killing a family. And oh, sorry, police officer didn't act, didn't undertake a duty. So there's a bunch of instances where police officers have not acted and they haven't been held accountable. But one situation in which they would be held accountable is negligently discharging a firearm and hitting someone. And that was one instance. And I think there's other instances where that doesn't hold water. Like I know there was a case in New York City where police officers were shooting at like a suspect and they hit like 5 bystanders or 3 bystanders. I doubt they were held legally liable there because they were shooting at a suspect. That's not negligent. And That's anecdotal. I don't have the evidence to back that up, but you know what I mean. So there's this line being delineated and articulated in the courts of action versus non-action, and that goes down to like the fundamentals of tort law and negligence. And they just say, even though the police have undertaken the monopoly duty of protecting the public, they say that, well, they're going to be treated like any other person when it comes to imposing liability on helping people. And I hope that makes sense. But
yeah, it does. And I guess maybe just to tie together the theme that we've been getting at this entire time is that it seems as though the social contract is very inept at actually creating an environment where the security services are accountable for the services that they are quote unquote selling. That the social contract is inept, and that we really do need to take the hardline stance and say that private security, if we're going to have any, is the only thing that's going to be acceptable in a free world.
Yeah, and that's because the social contract doesn't exist, you know. And I know you agree with me, but I'll belabor the point because the contracts have rules. There's rules to contracts, and a lot of them have to do with identifying specific parties, and they have to deal with mutual assent. And you know, coercion is something that invalidates every contract. That's contract 101. So if the social contract exists, then it should abide by, you know, the rules of contract formation, the common law rules. And hint, hint, the Constitution does not follow the rules of contract creation. So you can say it's a compact and that the political entities are the contracting parties, but that's a load of crap because people have to be informed. And there's no reason that there should be a double standard. If you have if an attorney is your agent, the agent has to do what you say, and that's in the private sector. And there should be no, you know, there should be no double standard. So.
Well, hey, Pat, it's always really good to talk to you. And I think that it's a tremendous benefit to the libertarian movement to have someone like yourself who's engaged and you're, you know, you're going out of your way to get involved in the legal sphere, which is something that, you know, I myself am reluctant enough just to even get into politics, let alone the legal sphere. So, I mean, I just want to express my gratitude that you're bringing this knowledge from your class into an area that is so important, which is legal theory in libertarianism, because it's really all contingent on that. Because we really do believe that the only laws, they're very simple laws, right? That your body and the property that you come to own from use of your body is there's no justification for trespass against it. So yeah, I mean, by holding a light to the broken legal system, I think it's really important. So yeah, well, always good to talk to you.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate that, and I appreciate your kind words. And I'm sorry that we couldn't meet up in person today. You know, life happens and stuff, but
we're not that far away. There'll be many more. So.
There will. Alrighty. Well, we'll talk to you later, bud. Oh, and before I close, sorry, before I forget, the show notes for this will be found at libertyweekly.net/55. For anyone listening to the audio version, there's also a video version up there and on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/libertyweekly. And I believe, will this be an episode of Subversion too?
Yes, it will. I'll have it at subversionwebcast.com/domestic violence.
Okay, excellent. And I'll include a link in the show notes as well for the paper so y'all can read it. I should have mentioned that earlier, but also you can get it through subscribing to my email list, which there will be a link as well. So, all right, everyone, thank you. Have a good weekend.
Goodbye, Liberty Weekly listeners and Subversion listeners.